Hey there, welcome to Bread Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. She sat by the shore and looked at the stars. How much time had passed? About 30 or 40 years, probably. People were probably living on Mars by now, had learned to cure cancer, and given all work to robots. But all she had seen during this time was only her house, the forest, and the lake. She tried not to forget her name. Once, long ago, when she still talked to people, they called her Marina. But she hadn't spoken to people in over 30 years. Behind her in the sky, thunder rumbled. That meant it would rain again. Rain came here constantly, almost half the days of the year. Very often, even in winter, not snow but rain fell on the village streets. In the huge, dense forest where the village stood, the area was southern after all. Compared to colder regions of the country, there was no winter here at all. All this was told to Marina by a local old woman at the bus stop next to the store. Poor thing, they sat on a bench under a concrete canopy on the main and probably only square of the village. Marina held a small backpack in her hands, and the old woman asked, "And you, dear, what brought you here? Do you have relatives here?" She smiled. It was clear that she had been waiting for this question from the very beginning. "I bought a house here. I'm going to live here." "What are you saying?" The old woman was surprised. "Here in this wilderness. Oh dear, all the young people are leaving here, not coming. And what will you live on?" Living wasn't a concern for Marina. "I worked well in the city. I can rest for a few years." Rest, the old woman started complaining about life again, but Marina wasn't listening anymore. She was looking at the sky, not as uniformly gray-white as in her city. Here the clouds were voluminous, multicolored, and bright sun rays broke through them. Marina was so used to factory smog that she couldn't even imagine such a beautiful sky in rainy weather. The old woman finished talking, sighed, and looked at the new neighbor. She was unlikely to try to convince her. Marina's smile never left her face. "Well, dear, where is that new house of yours? 15 Oak Street. Do you know where that is?" "Well, Oak Street, that's over there." The old woman pointed toward the street behind the store. "Consider it the only street here. And numbers, they don't hang them almost anywhere. Although no, the 15th house is where the shepherds live. There are birds painted on the gate. So 15 is probably the next one. But city folks already live there, came from the city as summer residents. And you've never been there before. No, first time. Well, how could you not know what you were buying?" The old woman wondered more and more. "Everything's fine," Marina continued to smile and look at the sky. "I bought through a reliable website. My friends bought real estate there. The site was really verified." Initially, Marina had gone to the site to look for work, but on the 5th page of listings, she saw it. It was a small wooden house in the forest by the lake shore. One room, a wood stove, a veranda, and even a pier for boats with some construction made of sticks. It was hard to tell from the photo what it was. And most importantly, the price was so cheap that Marina could take it right now. Just buy a house, take her savings, and live on them at rural prices for several years. Quit her job, stop paying rent, move away from her sporty, fashionable, successful friends, from parents who only asked when she would get married and then switched the conversation to politics. Walk in the forest in the mornings, gather mushrooms, start some kind of garden near the house. With such an amount, it was worth taking the risk. The rain almost stopped. Marina said goodbye to the old woman and went to the town hall. It turned out that the owner had died only 3 weeks ago. This was strange. Supposedly, after the owner's death, you need to wait 6 months before sale, even if there are no heirs and won't be. The notary initially looked somehow strangely at this, but then just between us, said that the deceased old man was actually never the owner, and the house had been in state ownership for many years, and he was simply allowed to live there, even without paying rent. They even felt sorry for the old man, and besides, no one would have bought it anyway. The documents Marina was shown in the city by the realtor, and everything seemed clean. She was buying real estate from the village council. From this whole conversation, only one thing became clear to her. There was something wrong with the previous owner, but formally, everything was fine. Marina signed the papers and received the keys to her new home. When she came out onto the street, she noticed what confused her even more. On the flag by the town hall doors hung a black ribbon. The house where birds were painted on the gate, Marina found immediately. And on the fence of the neighboring house, she saw a sign, Oak Street 37. Across the street on a bench sat 2 women, and next to them, a boy in a cap was picking at the ground with a stick and humming a very familiar melody to himself. In a few seconds, Marina realized it was Wind of Change by the Scorpions. The women were looking at her. She approached them, smiled, and asked, "Good afternoon. Could you tell me where house 15A is?" They looked at each other as if they had never heard such an address. Then they looked at Marina again and shrugged. One of them was much older and larger than the other, about 30 to 40 years old. Around her neck, she wore a red necklace. "It's by the lake." Marina got out a handkerchief to wipe her forehead. Such a small wooden one on the edge of the forest. Now the women looked at each other with obvious tension, as if her words had greatly frightened them. The older one asked, "And why are you asking about it? I bought it." Marina was surprised by such a reaction. "What's wrong with this house?" Tommy, the younger woman, probably his mother, called the boy. "Go play somewhere behind the garden." "Well, can I? I told you to go." The boy looked resentfully at his mother, then at Marina. When he went through the gate, the woman with the necklace looked at Marina with a tense, even angry look. "What's wrong with this house?" She told what was wrong with it. He had lived in it for a long time, over 30 years. No one knew where he came from. No one even knew what his name was. He never spoke. Most likely, the man was mute. But there were people who knew sign language and tried to talk to him with hand gestures. He didn't answer them either. What he ate was unclear. He had no garden near his house. He was never seen in the village. He was generally not seen before sunset. Most likely, during the day he simply slept, and people who passed by his house late in the evening said he sat on the same chair on his veranda and followed them with a terrible look. The first few years, they tried to establish contact with him, mainly a few neighboring alcoholics. But the old man didn't want to drink, didn't want to see anyone, and just waved his hand toward the exit from his property. Not so rudely that someone would punch him in the face, quite understandably. Then they generally saw nothing from him, except this strange, attentive look. Everyone understood that the man was simply crazy, and decided to leave him alone as long as he didn't bother anyone. But sometimes one more strangeness was noticed behind him. The woman with the necklace. Her name was Donna, lived in the house closest to him, and she was the first to notice these sounds when she was 12 years old. Tap, 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 and so from midnight to 6 in the morning, usually after rain. The neighbor knocked quietly and didn't disturb anyone's sleep. And when someone could hear him at night, it was easier not to pay attention than to go to the forest at night and get involved in problems with a psycho. Of course, it was strange to see how a hermit lived in the village, managing not to communicate with anyone, but they didn't want to get involved with this man. It seemed they were even glad that his house was not on the street, but somewhere in the forest at the edge of the village. The territory around his house was somehow tacitly ignored. Marina immediately understood what Donna felt awkward saying out loud. The old man was simply feared. But the really scary things started happening after his death. That's why there was a black ribbon on the flag. 3 weeks ago, tractor driver Stephen disappeared without a trace. He was last seen late in the evening. He told his daughter he'd be right back, went in the direction of that same house, and no one saw him again. And a day later, they couldn't find old Grandpa Walter. His wife thought he wanted to go to the bathroom or smoke, but he never returned. They searched the forest, questioned neighbors, examined the deceased crazy man's house. There were no traces of the missing anywhere. A week later, 9-year-old Natalie disappeared. This time, besides the local policeman, and there was only one here, criminal investigation and rescuers from the district center got involved. They searched with dogs with spotlights, but without result. Natalie wasn't the last. After her, the beginning of Anna Metrovich disappeared, an elderly saleswoman from the store, and then Cyril, a young man who had recently returned from the city where he worked as a tiler at construction sites. 5 missing in 3 weeks, and at least one of them was last seen on the road to the forest, to that part where on the lake shore stood the now empty house. The whole village started saying that a maniac had settled in the area. But then lovers of detective series began to object. What kind of maniac kills indiscriminately? Both men and women, both young and old. The police collected statements from everyone and said they had no right to comment until the investigation was completed. People said one thing, but between the lines, you could read what no one wanted to voice out loud. It wasn't a maniac taking people. It was the ghost of the one who lived in the house by the lake. Marina reached her new home quickly, about 600 feet through the forest, along a narrow path. Here grew huge trees, birds sang, moss-covered stones lay around. One of them, to the left of the path, was no smaller than an SUV. The story of the neighbors had frightened Marina a bit. Of course, it was unlikely that some mentally ill person remained after death to kill people. But a maniac, that was quite possible. She should have bought a stun gun or pepper spray before moving here. Nothing. There couldn't be more crime here than in her hometown anyway. Besides, she had come here, you could say, for reconnaissance, and would return to the city with things in a few days anyway. She definitely needed to find out the bus schedule. Marina came out of the forest. The photos on the website weren't lying. It was a classic wooden cabin, just without chicken legs. Behind the house grew a tall pine tree whose crown shape reminded her of a teddy bear. a two-slope roof with a chimney, a veranda that faced not the entrance to the cabin, but the shore, which was quite logical. First of all, she got out the keys and opened the big padlock on the door. As soon as she entered, she immediately began to notice the first oddities. In the only room, 9 by 9 feet, the only furniture was a bed and a nightstand with a winter blanket inside. By the wall stood a wood stove. Behind it on the floor was found a box of matches. At first, she thought that after the funeral or during the search for the missing, most things had been taken out from here. But a jacket hung on a nail by the entrance. Under it, rubber boots, in the corner an axe, and on the nightstand stood a glass. There was nothing else. Marina remade the bed, unpacked her things, sat on the bed, and looked around again. One thing was Spartan living, but this was already too much. Well, suppose our dear departed lived in the lake without electricity. People lived like that before somehow. By the way, she needed to buy a generator here. But why wasn't there any dishes anywhere? No forks, not even a trash bucket. What did this person eat for over 30 years? By the way, her neighbors said he didn't even have a garden. Marina left the house and looked around. Maybe he fed on mushrooms or tree bark, or hunted in the forest with an axe. Maybe he fished, and somewhere here there's a fishing rod. But this was joined by another oddity. Nowhere on the property was there even a toilet. The veranda was a simple continuation of the roof above and the floor below. Between them, 2 wooden posts. There stood a chair in front of a stool. On it lay an aluminum spoon. No plate, no pot, just a spoon. And although Marina had already seen many unusual things here, something seemed especially strange to her. It seemed that if you put a chair on the lake shore, it would be precisely to look at this lake. But here, everything was the opposite. The chair stood with its back to the lake, and its legs were nailed with nails to the floor. But the lake, unlike the house, looked normal, clean, transparent to several meters deep. The water surface went beyond the horizon, but not far away you could see the treetops on the other shore. Near the veranda stood something like a pier for boats, although only 6 feet long and without a boat. And at its far edge was that same wooden construction that Marina couldn't recognize in the photo. When she approached it, she guessed why. She had only once in her life seen this in an ethnography program. Before her stood a well sweep, not a bird, of course, but a device. Something like a well, although in that program, the well sweep was still used to get water from underground. And here it stood on the shore. So the former owner drank directly from the lake. And the pier wasn't a pier. It was built so that you could draw water with a bucket at sufficient depth. Marina undressed, swam for a few minutes, and returned to shore. At first, she thought about trying the water, but hesitated. She had about a pint of mineral water left that Marina had been drinking on the bus. Then she'd buy more at the store, and at the same time find out the schedule. And when a generator was installed here, then she could buy an electric kettle and draw water with the well sweep. She turned to go back to the house, but noticed something strange on the stones that protruded from the water. At one level, a few inches above the surface, were horizontal white stripes. Could there really be so many salts in this lake that they leave sediment? Maybe drinking this water really wasn't worth it at all. She approached closer to one stone, then to a second, to a third. No, the water was probably normal, because it wasn't about salts at all. All the stripes were painted with white paint. Marina returned to the house, changed clothes, and lay on the bed. Through both small windows on both sides of the door, she could see the sun setting behind the forest. There behind it was the village, Donna with her son Tommy and other people, except for those 5 who had disappeared in the last 3 weeks. And not far from here, somewhere quite nearby, she looked around toward the lake and realized there was another oddity that had been nagging somewhere in the background of her thoughts since she entered this house. The only wall with windows looked toward the road. On the opposite side, from the veranda side, there wasn't a single opening. And behind it, on this same veranda, was the chair turned with its back to the shore. It seemed that whoever built this house really didn't want to look at the lake. Marina, having just woken up, decided to explore the nearest part of the forest. For example, reach the other shore of the lake. She went down the not too high but steep hill, and in a few minutes came out to a small ravine, behind which she saw a clay cliff. She immediately wanted to call it Cheese Cliff, because the yellow slope was all covered with little holes. As far as she understood, these were swallow nests. It was very beautiful here. There were no empty beer bottles lying around, no eternal highway noise, and in general, the forest itself was much more like a forest than what she was used to, a 15-foot wide strip of planted poplars between fields and the road. Trees here were sometimes 3 feet wide and taller than a 9-story building. In another half hour, she came out to a high granite stone by the lake. She climbed on it, looked at the other shore, and saw the same pine tree with a crown in the shape of a teddy bear, and even the top of her roof. On the way back, she found a convenient wide path that led her to the stone the size of an SUV. From it, Marina turned left and came out to the house. During this hike, she drank all her water supply. The sun was already setting by that time, and the store had probably closed. Maybe she should taste the lake water. After all, it looked clean. The previous owner also drank it and lived long. And to the nearest factory, there were probably 60 miles. She hooked the bucket to the well sweep, got water, and poured herself a cup. She sniffed it, tried it, then drank it to the bottom. Quite normal water. Fresh, cold, much better than chlorinated tap water. Although there was some bitter aftertaste, it was even tastier, like expensive mineral water. She drank her fill and filled a bottle for tomorrow's hike. The first few days, Marina only explored the forest. Here flew huge insects, butterflies, beetles, dragonflies. Plants grew that she had never seen in her life. Sometimes she noticed deer, squirrels, badgers, and was always afraid that someday she'd meet a bear or wild boar. Marina had been planning for the 3rd day to go to the store to buy some food. But actually, the change of environment had greatly reduced her appetite. She barely finished the few sandwiches she had brought with her on the road, just so they wouldn't spoil at the bottom of the backpack. There was still a pack of crackers with raisins, but that was for later. The main thing was not to forget to take a bottle of lake water before going to the forest. Despite the constantly humid air, she wanted to drink often, and it turned out that its slightly bitter aftertaste was very refreshing on such hikes. In the end, in the evening, Marina still decided to walk to the village center to go to the store, and at the same time find out when the bus to the city would be. All these 3 days, she had only walked in the forest around the lake, and managed to get lost on the 600-foot path that led to the street. Probably somewhere this path branched, and she didn't notice how she turned the wrong way. She lost half an hour, and in a state of light panic came out to the village in a completely different place than she intended. Strange, because she wasn't one of those girls who suffered from topographical stupidity. At the store, Marina discovered another unpleasant thing. Her voice had become very hoarse. She hadn't noticed this before, or she hadn't talked to anyone for 3 days. She didn't feel any throat pain or any symptoms of a cold. But now, when she tried to explain to the saleswoman what she wanted to buy, instead of a normal voice, she spoke with some kind of wheeze. The feeling was as if she had been screaming at the top of her lungs all night. Moreover, the saleswoman herself had only been working there for the 2nd week, and this further complicated the matter. From people at the bus stop, she managed to find out that the nearest bus to the city would go in 4 days at 10 p.m. She walked back the same way she had come the first time when she arrived here. And although the sun was setting and it was already quite dark, this time she didn't get lost from the road. Although she wasn't even watching it, about an hour after Marina returned home, it started raining again. Much heavier than the one 3 days ago. She lay in bed, but sleep wouldn't come for several hours, and she read a book by flashlight. She managed to fall asleep only around midnight. It rained all night and all day. It began to weaken only closer to evening. When Marina went out to the lake, she noticed that the white paint marks were now below the water level. That night, it was again hard for her to fall asleep. Before moving here, she had never thought about what happens in a village after sunset. On the first night, Marina couldn't believe that when she lay in bed with closed eyes, she saw exactly the same thing as with open eyes. That is, absolutely nothing. In the city, even the sky glowed slightly at night, not to mention street lamps. Here both her windows faced the forest in front of the house, so you couldn't even see stars. As strange as it sounds, this didn't help but, on the contrary, interfered with falling asleep. Outside, rain was still lightly dripping. Eventually, she managed to doze off somehow, but not for long. She was awakened by some sound. Marina opened her eyes, although it was useless, and listened. For a few seconds, there was nothing except rare raindrops. But then, from the wall that adjoined the veranda, she heard what made goosebumps run all over her body. The sound was like dragging some very heavy sack through the grass, only no footsteps were heard, as if this sack was dragging itself. The rustling was rhythmic and moved now along the right wall of the house. Someone was clearly there, and he was moving toward the entrance. Marina was paralyzed with fear. On one hand, she was afraid to remain defenseless when this someone, surely that same maniac, would start breaking down the door, or, even worse, think to simply break the window. On the other hand, the very thought of getting up from bed to take the axe by the stove, or simply shine a flashlight on the door, and thereby possibly attract his attention, frightened her immensely. What made this rustling was now at the corner of the house. Marina was half sitting, half lying on the bed and not moving, only trembling so much that it was hard for her to breathe. And the rustling sound was heard approximately in the same direction, somewhere at the corner of the house, between the front and right walls. For several more minutes, she listened and barely breathed before she was finally convinced. The rustling was moving away. Marina waited another 10 minutes, then lit the flashlight, found the axe in the corner by the stove, and returned with it to bed. She tried very hard not to let the light fall on the wall where the door was, so that this something wouldn't notice its light from the forest. That's how she explained it to herself. Actually, she was much more afraid of what she might see behind the glass if she shone the flashlight out the window. She was so frightened that she couldn't fall asleep soon. Who or what could it be? If we discard paranormal things, then either a person or a very large animal. Marina remembered in all details this rustling sound and was absolutely sure that there were no human footsteps in it. Even animal steps didn't sound like this, although she could already doubt this. Hard to say how much time passed in such a nervous state. It seemed like a whole night, but probably about an hour or two later, Marina calmed down. Her breathing evened out, the trembling passed, and she could already think coherently about the fact that maybe moving here wasn't the best idea. The state of panic and paralysis passed. There were no sounds except rare raindrops. Therefore, Marina reacted a bit more calmly when she heard the rustling again. She just lay on the bed with a flashlight and axe, and that motionless creature crawled in the opposite direction. From the forest, the rustling approached the corner of the house, crawled to the right along the wall, then went somewhere toward the veranda. Only then did Marina hear a completely different sound, and suddenly realized what had woken her up an hour ago. It was the splash of water. The creature dove into the lake. Probably it was some kind of animal, a bear or wild boar or wolf. At night, it rummaged around the house, and although Marina thought by size the creature was no smaller than a pig, frightened imagination could greatly exaggerate everything. So it could quite well be a wolf, and there remained the most banal option, just a neighbor's dog that was untied for the night. And that's nothing that the sound was little like human or animal steps. If you encounter such a thing in the dark of night, fantasy naturally turns on full power and invents the most terrible monsters. So most likely it was just a dog. In extreme cases, a wolf or wild boar. It walked back and forth, climbed in to dive into the lake, and returned home to the forest. That's all. Marina sat on the pier by the well sweep with a glass, drinking water, and looking at the lake. By lunchtime, when she woke up, the rain had already stopped dripping. From behind the clouds came bright sun, so bright that some pain settled in her eyes. The grass was still wet, and the marks on the stones were below the water level. Marina looked toward the opposite shore, so she heard footsteps only when the man approached her almost close. Good health, Marina startled to the side and sharply turned around. Before her stood a young man in black uniform under a plastic raincoat and green rubber boots. He was chewing something, probably gum. Easy, easy. The man also stepped back and raised his palm forward, as if he wanted to calm her. Junior Sergeant Malotsky, Police Department. Yes, I'm listening. Marina's voice was so hoarse that she could sing black metal. Are you a bit cold? Have you caught something? The junior sergeant clarified her name and surname, then asked what she was doing last night. Marina replied that she was sleeping at home. To the question of whether she heard or saw anything last night, she habitually replied no. She wanted this to sound convincing and without unnecessary tension, because she herself didn't understand why she was lying to this person now. The policeman didn't question her for long. He said thank you, goodbye, and after that looked at Marina attentively, probably giving her a chance to ask him questions. It turned out that last night a woman had disappeared. Her name was Maria, and she was 65 years old. The last time her neighbor saw her was when Maria was walking down the street, just by the turn to Marina's house. The neighbor didn't attach any importance to this. She thought the old woman was simply going home. This happened around midnight. Be more careful. If you notice anything strange, Sergeant Malotsky said, Marina, so as not to wheeze unnecessarily, just nodded. I'll stay here tonight, patrolling the road to you. If you see or hear anything, immediately shout. Or, I don't know, bang loudly on something. Do you want some gum? He took out a pack of Orbit from his pocket and offered it to Marina, but she didn't want any. The policeman shrugged, said goodbye, and wanted to leave. But it was clear that all this time he wanted to ask something else. Can I have some water from you? My throat is very dry. Marina scooped a glass from the bucket and handed it to the sergeant, but he just asked suspiciously, Oh, and you get this from the lake? She nodded, No, thank you. I'd rather drink from the well over there. All the best. Probably she was ready for this, hoped it wouldn't happen, calmed herself, convinced herself, but still subconsciously prepared for the worst. Otherwise, why would Marina have gone to bed that night in the embrace of an axe? The phone that was almost dead showed 12:14 a.m. The same time and the same route. The creature emerged from the lake, crawled past the veranda, and then along the wall to the right. But this night, something changed. When the rustling reached the corner and turned left, and after two such rustlings approached the front door, Marina tried to breathe as quietly as possible. But from fear, on the contrary, she wanted to take full lungs of air and scream with all her might. Tears flowed from her eyes, which saw absolutely nothing, and to blow her nose, she had to very carefully wipe her face on the blanket. If not for her hoarse voice, Marina would probably have squealed like a frightened dog under the blanket now. In her hand lay a flashlight, but for nothing in the world would she agree to shine it out the window now, for fear of seeing what was standing in front of her house right now. She would have died immediately and didn't even doubt it. For several minutes, this animal or creature or visitor tested her patience, and then decided to crawl where it had been yesterday. The rustling gradually moved away toward the village, with the same rhythm that Marina would remember until her death. And as it had been 24 hours ago, soon it returned, crawled past the house, and dove into the lake. The phone showed 8 minutes past 2. Marina was so afraid to give herself away that she climbed under the blanket to look at the time. And then she caught herself with one very unpleasant thought that had been sitting in her head for a long time and was quite obvious, but frightened so much that she didn't want to admit it. There was no point in hiding from this creature. It knew perfectly well that Marina was here. This night she managed to fall asleep only when the sky began to light. She woke up at 7 in the evening, remembered what had happened at midnight, and burst into tears. Marina buried her face in the pillow and sobbed. She just wanted peaceful rural life. Not a billion on a Bentley, not a mansion in Spain, not a Nobel Prize. Just to live peacefully, rest from everyone for at least a few years, and for no one to bother her. Why did she get this house with a monster? Damn maniacs, she thought, and beat the mattress with her fist. After about 20 minutes, she calmed down and went outside. She didn't want to eat at all, but she wanted to swim. She approached the pier and undressed. Screw it, she wanted right now despite this creature. She'd get out only in a few hours anyway. Marina jumped into the water and swam away from the pier. She dove headfirst to wash away the tears. Maybe she should leave, and not to bring the rest of her things here, but on the contrary, to get the hell out of here. She surfaced and swam back. Or maybe she shouldn't. For some reason, this beast didn't touch her. And in general, where's the evidence that people are killed by precisely this creature? Wandering around the house at night isn't yet a crime. She got out on the pier, dried herself, got dressed, and drank water from the bucket. Tomorrow she'd figure out how events would develop. Some small white object was visible in the grass not far from the shore and caught her attention. Marina bent down to look. It was an orbit package, and the marks on the stones were still below the water level. Her packing took no more than half an hour. The phone battery was only 2% left. All these days Marina hadn't used it at all, wanting to save the battery to somehow get to the village to recharge. But it was too late now. On the clock was 7:49 p.m. The sun was almost behind the forest line. She had more than 2 hours left until the bus. And if during the time she had lived here, nothing unusual had happened, Marina would not even have hurried. But now she felt that she really needed a time reserve. She locked the door and took one last look at her house, where she never wanted to return again. It seemed nothing had changed. A cabin without chicken legs, a tall pine tree with a crown in the shape of a teddy bear, forest and lake. To hell with everything. Now she'd figure out all the problems in her city life. Compared to the nightmare of the last 2 nights, they didn't even seem like problems to her anymore. The flashlight suspiciously dimmed, and this made her nervous. Probably in vain, she had read a book at night 2 days ago. And in vain, she hadn't bought spare batteries at the store while it still worked. While it still worked, she needed to walk these unfortunate 600 feet of forest and get to the village. As soon as Marina did this, she'd be safe. She just needed not to turn off the path, walk between the trees, walk and walk correctly. Past that place where to the right lies a huge stone the size of an SUV, even a cliff, you could say. And not get nervous and not get distracted. It was getting darker every minute. There was still not enough to miss some turn. Here there seemed to be no turns at all. But last time, she managed to come out somewhere wrong. The phone held on as it could. When Marina looked at it for the last time, the clock showed 8:38 p.m. But the flashlight let her down when it was needed most. The path had long been lost, and she stood in the middle of completely unfamiliar terrain. Around were all the same trees, bushes, and stones, but she no longer understood where to go and where she had come from. She tried to scream, but her voice had become so hoarse that not even a wheeze was heard. She tried to bang on trees with her feet so someone would hear her, but only quickly got tired and still stood there all alone. There was almost no light left. The tree branches could barely be distinguished from the sky, and the forest on all sides merged into one solid black stripe. Marina fell to her knees and cried for the second time in 24 hours. Probably subconsciously, she just wanted to restore her strength, because when the tears ended, an idea came to her head. Even in such a state, she understood that this idea was completely stupid, dictated only by panic and despair. Perhaps it would even be better if she didn't start doing this. But on the other hand, nature didn't just invent panic for nothing. In a critical situation, when logic can't offer any options, there remains a simple choice: fight or run. And Marina ran. She screamed, although only a whisper came out, and even not a wheeze, but already from anger, not from fear. The left palm that she held in front of her face protected her from accidentally hitting branches in the eye. Although this didn't protect against stones and holes underfoot, and Marina fell several times. She didn't even try to count them. Her pants tore at the knees, and a whole network of scratches and cuts appeared on her face and arms. And in general, all her clothes were covered in mud and leaves. When she finally saw in the black tree crowns a barely noticeable clearing of dark blue sky, nervous laughter escaped her, and Marina slowed down to catch her breath. The clearing grew, descended to the horizon. It was clear that she was coming out to some large open space, probably to a field or road. To the left and ahead of her was something large and black. It was hard to say what, because except for the sky, everything was black now. But soon she came closer and saw that it was a high stone. And when she approached it closely and examined it, she saw that the stone was granite. Slowly and without a smile anymore, Marina walked a few more meters, pushed apart the branches of a bush, and saw on the horizon opposite her the tall pine tree with a crown in the shape of a teddy bear. Panic began to return to her, and the last 30 feet she ran. She could have run further, but further was the lake. Marina tried to scream with all the power of her lungs, but no one heard her. She was even surprised how easily she had found the way to the house. The path was clear, wide between the trees. A few yards to the left, the lake's surface flickered. She walked past the ravine, then not far from the cheese cliff where the swallows lived, climbed the hill, and in 10 minutes came out to the stone the size of an SUV, behind which the road forked. To the right was the village, just a few minutes on foot, and to the left was the house. Marina didn't know what time it was now. Most likely, her bus had left several hours ago. But this was no longer important. She needed to go home. And as soon as she thought this, she heard that same sound that made all her hair stand on end. The sound came from the right. The creature was moving back to the lake. Marina hid behind the stone, pressed her back against it, froze, and when she listened, realized that this time the sound was different from something. As if besides this rustling, she heard something else. The rustling approached and was already approximately behind her back, but against its background was like a human voice. Only this voice didn't speak words, but made some humming. It was hard to make out, but it seemed like it was music. The voice, seemingly a child's, hummed a very familiar melody. In a few seconds, Marina realized what it was, and tears flowed down her cheeks. The voice of a little boy sang "Wind of Change" by the Scorpions. When the knock at the door woke her up, it was already evening. On the doorstep, she saw the same 2 women who a few days ago had told her about the history of her house. The old woman with a wooden cane and the young one, now without the red necklace. It seemed her name was Donna. She was all on edge, practically hysterical, and spoke mainly through the old woman. She explained that last night Donna's son Tommy had disappeared. Marina tried to say something and pointed to her throat. The old woman's face became even more serious, and Donna looked at her as if she wanted to burn her alive. The old woman once again tried to explain that Marina could help them in the search. She said they would, of course, write a statement to the police. But the only policeman in the village had disappeared literally yesterday, and the department was closed. But here Donna broke. What are you explaining to her? It's all her. Well, look at her. It's all her. She's already become like that crazy man. She sleeps during the day, is silent, will soon start knocking at night. Doesn't go anywhere, doesn't show herself to people. What should I calm down about? Which, she's a maniac. The spirit of that old man has possessed her. She's taking revenge now on us. I just don't understand for what. What did we do to you? What did my Tommy do to you, you beast? Marina just stood and looked at them. The sunlight unpleasantly burned her eyes. Even if she could speak, she had nothing to say to them. The old woman stood between Donna and Marina and somehow managed to drag her friend home. But even from behind the trees, she continued to shout curses and threats. The sun was setting behind the trees, and the sky above the lake was already dark. Marina approached the well sweep, drew water, and drank several cups at once. Then she sat on the edge of the pier facing the opposite shore and began to look at the stars. Her voice was finally completely gone. Now she was completely mute, and she hadn't had an appetite for several days. Marina simply stopped eating. Accordingly, no waste came out of her either. She had a delay of a week already, although the last time she had sex was 4 months ago. It seemed that the only biological need she had left was the need to drink water. Lake water, which, by the way, no longer tasted bitter at all. The sunlight hurt her eyes, and waking up shortly before sunset was now much more convenient. She couldn't go far from home. The forest territory had closed and turned into her personal globe. Other people could come here only if someone wanted to visit the girl, who had gone crazy, just like the previous owner of the house. She thought she could try to ask for help, for example, when someone else came to her. With gestures, explain that she needed paper and write everything that was needed on it. Warn people that something dangerous lived in the lake. Interesting, would anyone believe her? Hardly, or in such a case, she could follow that person so they would be her guide. Only Marina suspected that at best, both of them would get lost, and in her presence, the person wouldn't be able to get out of the forest. But there was also a worse option. But the strangest thing was different. She now liked the lake. She liked drinking its water, liked swimming in it despite the creature somewhere in the depths. And maybe, although this creature forced Marina to tremble with fear, she liked this creature too. Anyway, the creature didn't touch Marina, and it wasn't hard to guess why now they were each other's own kind. Marina sat on the pier for several hours, drank from the glass, and looked at the stars. And when midnight was approaching, she got up and went back. She had a strong fever, and not from cold but from fear. Despite the fact that all the facts had already formed into a single picture, she was still very scared. But now she knew what needed to be done. Marina sat on the same chair nailed to the floor, in front of the stool, with her back to the lake and face to the wall. There was no rain or even wind that night. Therefore, she clearly heard how waves on the lake's surface began to roll onto the shore. Through the grass behind her back, something crawled. Marina's teeth chattered, her hands and knees trembled. She even wanted to turn around to finally see the creature that was terrorizing the village. But she understood that she couldn't. Maybe because then she would go completely crazy. The creature crawled closer. She needed to calm the trembling limbs, at least her right hand, because a mistake in movements now could kill her. With this hand, Marina gripped the spoon with all her strength. Not much was left to her back. Marina took a deep breath and tried to calm down a little. After all, if this doesn't work, there are no more chances. So she did the only thing that remained. The rustling stopped. What lived in the lake and kidnapped people? What made this terrible rustling sound? Crawled a little more and froze. Marina looked straight ahead and was afraid to turn her head even a centimeter. And the creature stood right behind her back. Everyone agreed that it was still a maniac after all. There was one, and then he disappeared. People stopped disappearing, and thank God. The missing were never found. And when they legally changed from missing to dead, they were buried in empty coffins. Soon life in the village calmed down again. Children, if they were still born here, grew up and, as a rule, went to the city. Elderly people died. After them remained only empty houses that were of little interest to heirs. Few people talked about it, but everyone knew. If you follow the path to the forest, you can find a lake. Near it, in a small house, for over 30 years now lives a crazy old woman. She's mute and absolutely harmless. She feeds on God knows what. She never leaves the house, and she doesn't have her own garden. During the day she sleeps, and at night sometimes you can hear how she taps out the same rhythm from midnight to 6 in the morning. Tap, 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 tap. Usually this happens after rain. I'm sure each of you can give an example of things that amaze others, but seem like absolute everyday life to you. Most often this is due to the specifics of the region where you live. In rarer cases, it's a peculiarity of the person. So for a hypothetical resident of Scandinavian countries, it's the Northern Lights. In my case, such everyday life was the so-called Scythian statues. Where I come from, they were absolutely commonplace, something the locals barely paid attention to. But in vain. Lifeless stone figures with frightening primitive carvings. Maybe some of you visited museums as children and managed to see them with your own eyes. Or maybe someone had enough sense to even touch these cursed sculptures. Now I sympathize with you. Better wash your hands after that. Many, many times, until they become pink and ulcers appear on the skin from sores. That's much better than what might stick to you after dozens of years. Now it seems to me that even death is better than this. I don't know if my advice will help you or not. It didn't help me. You can't scrub consciousness and psyche clean, and the vaunted alcohol only makes it worse. Here I should probably make an introduction. Before I tell you my story, explain, so to speak, my motivation for writing all this. If you're listening to this, then most likely nothing worked out for me. It's still unclear why my story is more of a guarantee to myself, just hidden in a public place. Wherever you come across my story, remember, if I posted it online in this form, then nothing worked out for me. The idea to package my entire past year, during which I shared my life with others, into a coherent story was suggested to me by forum members. Greetings to the psychonauts. Otherwise, I would have left everything as it was. This is especially difficult for me because some events that I separated from myself will have to be relived again. And I'll also try to describe them in as much detail as possible. Over the past year, I've been called everything: crazy, drug addict, troll, poor writer. They even tried to de-anonymize me, which, however, some particularly persistent people succeeded in, and somehow no one came to me. Because, spoiler alert, where I live now, there's a war going on. I'm not forcing anyone to listen to this. My story, like the forum that appears here, is hidden in 5 links. Without special desire, everything is verified there, including photos that obviously make no sense to add here. Now I can barely imagine how to tell everything without spoilers, roughly understanding how my story will end. If you have questions while listening, don't rush to conclusions. Closer to the end, much will become clear. For forum members listening to this, there will be little new. But for those who haven't heard yet, I can only say one thing. Sit more comfortably, because the story will be long. Everything started in 2006, a few months before my 16th birthday. It was an unnaturally hot May. School was coming to an end, and I usually told my classmates about heaven on earth, about the village where I went every summer, where in sunny lowlands, bushes and grass of almost forest height go into the unknown distance to the very horizon. How we would brew milk from grass with the village boys and fry porridge from the same grass. About thermonuclear moonshine and unpretentious girls who sunbathe naked by the ponds. In those last May school days before vacation, I could tell them for hours what my summer would be like. That's how I imagined it. That's how previous vacations went, but not these ones. I used to go to that village to visit my grandfather on my mother's side. Grandpa worked at the mine all his life, and as long as I remember him, he was constantly sick, constantly going to various sanatoriums for treatment. It so happened that another trip to a boarding house fell on my arrival. It was precisely under this pretext that I persuaded 2 of my classmates to come with me. If you look at the names of villages in my region, it might seem that there are only 2 months on the calendar, October and May. My fate was the village of Mayfield. I keep saying village, village all the time. But for you to better understand what kind of place this was, I'll make a small digression. Mayfield was a small mining village 40 kilometers from my city. All the benefits of civilization were present there. And at that time, in some places, there was even internet. They started giving out houses to miners there just before the collapse of the Union. And at the time of my youth, there were somewhere around 500 houses. Except for a huge ravine that some called deep, others called wide, there was nothing particularly remarkable. Another matter was the vicinity of this ravine. It was there, to the very horizon, that these cursed Scythian statues were visible. The locals didn't particularly notice them, just like I did until that fateful summer. Before the trip, I told my classmates Steve and Rick everything, spun up the village boys, how I'd introduce them, what kind of drinking party we'd have, what a whole gang would gather, how we'd make noise throughout the area. I told all this confident that it would be so. But from the very beginning, everything somehow didn't work out. Going there, I imagined how we'd be met right from the bus stop, and we'd just throw our things at my place and immediately go to the ponds, after which we'd drink beer and grilled sausages until morning. But as soon as we got off the bus, we didn't meet anyone until we reached my house. Everything around was literally frozen like in a photograph. "Damn, is it always this quiet here?" Steve asked, looking around warily. "Yeah, I somehow never paid much attention to it," I said, and for the first time since childhood noticed the silence that had always been there. His question can rightfully be considered the starting point of the series of subsequent events that I began to notice. And here, without spoilers, it won't work. For example, how do you like the fact that for the nearest, God knows how many kilometers, there wasn't a single tree? Or that no one had any domestic animals, no livestock, no chickens, no guard dogs, no cats? Even mice didn't live there. All these terrible facts surfaced for me much later, even too late. Well, for now, keep them in mind. We came to my grandfather's house with the boys, threw our things, and went looking for at least someone from the village boys. Passing one house after another where their grandparents also lived, after going through a dozen houses, we gave up. The sun was at its zenith, hunger was making itself known, and finally we met one of my acquaintances. From his words, this year no one was worth waiting for. Someone was retaking exams at school. Someone was entering college. He was local, so he was here now. He suggested going to look for the twin brothers, Crooked and Shaggy, two equally bad local guys. They lived with a constantly drunk father who, returning from the mine, would get drunk on moonshine that he made himself and stare at himself for hours. Crooked and Shaggy were twins, but slightly wrong, as if one had absorbed the other in the womb. Shaggy was smarter, unlike the completely stupid Crooked, but to be honest, this didn't make him smart in general human terms. All their crazy antics in my memory they did together with their brother. For example, they threw a miner's self-rescuer into the fire and, laughing, ran away. They set off firecrackers at home, which eventually burned down the summer kitchen. They were a year younger than me. Crooked no longer had a pinky finger due to an unsuccessful homemade explosive, and Shaggy had managed to serve time in juvenile detention for stealing a bicycle. It was in their company that we planned to spend the evening. Coming to the twins' house, we found their drunk father. With great difficulty, he explained to us that Crooked and Shaggy were at the ravine looking for metal. We bought a liter of warm moonshine from him and headed toward the ravine. It was visible from any point in the village, an endless lowland studded with spots of stones and statues. They once wanted to lay a highway through it, brought a bunch of stuff. Then the Union collapsed, and everything was left lying there. Concrete slabs, huge rings, a pile of reflectors and supporting structures for bridges. Soon, cars started coming to the part they managed to lay and dumping construction waste in the ravine. We used to go there to collect metal, look for something interesting. But mostly there was nothing but fragments of brick and plaster. We didn't have to look for the twins long. As soon as we went down into the ravine, we immediately heard heavy blows from the direction of the dump. Crooked and Shaggy were now engaged in breaking concrete slabs with sledgehammers and extracting reinforcement from them. When I reached them, I literally didn't recognize them. Last summer I had said goodbye to emaciated, thin boys in somewhat ridiculous clothes. Now before me stood two guys with healthy, vein-covered broad shoulders. Visually, Crooked and Shaggy now differed little. Both looked like athletes. Shaggy already had stupid dark mustaches, and on Crooked's face protruded a repeatedly shaved stubble. Although they were a year younger than me, I, like my school friends Steve and Rick, was covered at that time only with white fuzz. None of us had even shaved once yet. Getting acquainted with each other, we sat for a while at the dump, drank the sugary moonshine, eating it with bread that the twins had brought. And somehow everything started to stir, and I even began to remember how we had fun all previous years. But only from the faces of my school friends could you easily read that they felt uncomfortable. If Rick was still trying to get pleasure from what was happening, then Steve openly said that he didn't like them. He said, and I myself began to notice, that the guys from the village are outright thugs and gopniks. All my excuse was based on the fact that I knew them from childhood, but after his words, scales seemed to fall from me. In this already new reality, now I also felt uncomfortable. Paul, whom we met first, somehow quickly got drunk and constantly talked nonsense. At first, we still tried to understand what he was saying, but very soon we stopped paying attention to him. So his raving soon turned into quiet crying. The twins caught a chanson wave on their pocket radio and silently smoked. Rick, slightly drunk, looked somewhere into the distance, and Steve kept trying to get me to leave. Then what can be considered the beginning of my end happened. The beginning of the end for all of us. After another suggestion from Steve, unexpectedly for me, Shaggy somehow consciously looked at my friends and asked, "And did he show you our main attractions?" He asked and put out his cigarette butt on the sledgehammer handle, lying at his feet. We were almost buying a new one. Crooked joined the conversation and smiled. "Yeah, just your help would be appropriate. We put rails there. We need everyone to work together to turn it over." Shaggy continued. He was talking about Scythian statues. I'll emphasize again that until that day. For me, these were just stones, of which there were so many in our village that I simply didn't notice them. "Let's go, you'll be the first to see a new one. We've been digging it for several months," Shaggy said, and jumped up. They took sledgehammers, gathered their things, and we headed toward the center of the ravine. Along the way, we passed about a dozen Scythian statues standing, lying, half protruding from the ground. All of them followed us with their dead presence. As if I hadn't been drunk and so stupid, maybe even then I would have understood that something was wrong around us. And we kept walking, until it became cold around us under the scorching May sun. We moved in a chain, one after another, but what the twins had dug up was visible behind the backs of everyone walking in front of me. An incredibly huge, long block on which, with great difficulty, under dirt and grass, you could see carved depressions. This was the largest Scythian statue I had ever seen in my life. Usually they're no more than a few meters in height, but this one was, it seemed to me, about 15 feet. Rails protruded from its side. They made its silhouette look like a voodoo doll. It turned out that the figure was lying face down, and the brothers wanted to turn it over. "Let's take turns leaning on each one. And you, Crooked, watch so the lever doesn't slip," Shaggy said, and threw his things next to their peculiar archaeological site. We looked at their crazy construction in amazement and didn't know which side to approach. And they were already pushing the first rail with all their might. "Here, you two, and you push the next one," Shaggy commanded, jumping on the rail. "Come on, a little more. Crooked, push and push more from the opposite side." And the giant figure slowly began to turn. The earth began to give way with a crack. The rail, the figure slowly turned, tearing out pieces of earth overgrown with grass. Even with the imprint of earth and insects scattering in all directions, I could clearly see the face that appeared before my eyes, from which a chill ran through my whole body, as if I was simultaneously being looked at by a mantis, a bird, and a wolf. A long muzzle, like a continuation of an insect's head, and in a second already a beak, or rather a mouth. This muzzle-beak-head mouth was severely damaged, as if someone had tried to destroy it with all their might, beating it with a stone with their last strength. I looked lower and lower. The head area smoothly transitioned into a torso, from which drooping, carved breasts went down to an unnaturally protruding belly. This sculpture was clearly pregnant. This was unmistakably visible. Small carved hands supported the protruding belly from the sides. If it weren't for last year's rains, we wouldn't have dug it up. So much water flowed here that dozens of lying ones were revealed. Me and Crooked turned over almost all of them, but they're small. And this damn thing is huge. Never seen one like this, Shaggy said, and started walking on the lying figure. Let's drink, Crooked shouted, and took out moonshine. We started passing the bottle of moonshine around in a circle, which became 10 times more disgusting. By this relatively sober time, the twins began to get visibly drunk and started talking nonsense. The one standing on the stone began jumping on its belly. "Look, it seems to be hollow," he shouted, and began happily stomping on it with his foot. From these words, even the already stupid Crooked seemed to go completely crazy, and laughing, began directing a sledgehammer raised above his head toward the center of the belly. It seemed to me that everyone was screaming at that moment, including Paul, who could barely move his tongue. Don't, we all managed to shout as Crooked delivered the first blow to the center of the belly. Stop, enough, everyone shouted at him. But he stopped only after the belly, cracking, slid to the ground. Have you ever dreamed of all your teeth falling out at once, and your tongue passing over bare, soft meat? Those who have will probably understand what I felt at that moment. I understood that something very, very bad, wrong, and fatal was happening. Looking into the center of the hole where the belly used to be, I tried to give an explanation for what was happening. It seemed to me that there couldn't be anything like this in a solid stone. Even then, I knew that Scythian statues are carved on the surface of stone, not cast from stone or fastened with stone. They were always solid stone, and there couldn't be cavities inside. But here was a very frightening cavity, and even filled with something dark, similar to leaves. I didn't know the name for such a thing, but I was sure it existed. After all, dirt can stick together around pressed leaves, take a certain shape, harden, and then crack, forming absolutely dry leaves inside itself. I kept thinking about this, and together with those around me, approached closer and closer. Crooked, who had gone crazy, was laughing and wasn't going to stop. He stuck his hand into what I initially perceived as leaves and began throwing it around like confetti. Looking at the stone figure with a broken belly, I felt a frightening sensation, as if vibrations of anger were coming from it. It began to dawn on me that what I had earlier taken for cold was fear that had permeated this place. My hands were covered with cold sweat, and my cheekbones were cramped with horror. And then, what happened that I couldn't get rid of after so many years occurred. I looked inside the belly of this Scythian statue. The brain has an amazing ability to censor extremely frightening experiences. And it seems to me that at that moment, it covered my conscious eyes with both hands, so I wouldn't see what was inside. If your parents ever covered your eyes when a scary movie was on TV, then you know better than me that even in the densest palms, there are cracks between the fingers. And I had enough of such a crack to look with literally one eye. Inside this stone belly lay a small dried skeleton with human outlines. The previously mentioned leaves turned out to be small black feathers that filled this belly. I looked at this little body, and my brain was literally being doused with radioactive boiling water. My gaze, as much as I tried, was captured by this creature, and then I looked a little lower and saw that inside this embryo was another, smaller skeleton, as if inside its belly. And there seemed to be another one there. I was swaying as if in a trance, and my consciousness continued its journey into recursive hell, looking at smaller and smaller bone embryos inside the next embryo. I don't know how long this terrible experience lasted, but coming out of stupor, I was horrified even more. All the boys around me were lying on the grass in epileptic fits. Thick foam was coming from their mouths, and their throats were making sounds similar to snoring. I once heard that a person in such a state should be turned on their side so they don't swallow their tongue. But as soon as I started to do this, they all synchronously fell silent and began coming to their senses without any pauses. My eyes were full of horror, and they, as if nothing had happened, got to their feet and, smiling, began passing the bottle of moonshine to each other. I quickly turned to the hole in the belly, but it was no longer there. The stone was absolutely smooth, only with a small depression in the belly area. Shaggy shoved the bottle of moonshine into my hands. From the fear that still hadn't receded, I took a sip and almost threw up everything. The fear seemed to recede, and everyone behaved as if nothing had happened. Even the dim-witted Crooked looked normal. The twins began collecting their things, threw sledgehammers over their shoulders, and to the intermittent sound of chanson from the pocket radio, began moving toward the village. Everyone followed them, and my legs carried me on their own. The moonshine quickly hit my head, and the fear receded. Leaving the lowland of the ravine, I suddenly turned around as if someone had called me, and for a moment met eyes with that Scythian statue. Only now it was standing. Rick was walking in front of me. I pulled him by his t-shirt. He turned around. Powerlessly, I pointed in that direction with my hand and couldn't explain what I wanted to say. He also mumbled something in response, and we walked on. Well, then we drank, so I only remember separate flashes. How I looked at the lantern in the twins' yard, and how we walked somewhere in the darkness, and then morning. I remember waking up and seeing Rick looking at me with wide-open eyes. On his face was dark, slightly greenish stubble mold. It covered his face evenly, going from the neck down under his clothes. And Steve, who was saving himself from the hangover in the kitchen, was also covered in mold. It covered his ears and neck behind his head. But I didn't find anything like this on myself, and even sighed with relief. This frightened them so much that after they washed in the summer shower, we left my village that same day. While we were waiting for the bus, I kept asking them what they remembered about yesterday's trip, whether they remembered how they lay in fits, whether they remembered the broken belly. But the last thing they remembered was meeting Paul and buying moonshine. After that, both couldn't remember anything. At that moment, it seemed to me that I had been spared. We got on the bus, came to the city, and went our separate ways. I would also like to end my story here, but unfortunately, this is where it only begins. Next, I'll try to be more concise, and will skip entire years of my life. Steve and I still communicated at school, but after graduation, our paths diverged. Steve left after graduation, and I never saw him again. But Rick stayed in our city. He'll appear again in my story later. I never went to the village again. My grandfather died 2 years later, and that house stood empty. During this time, my parents divorced. Well, and I began to decline. After 11th grade, instead of university, I went to college. That's how I continued to live drinking. working at low-paying hard labor, and slowly sliding further into nowhere. Rick, by the way, during this time managed to marry a small, fat girl. He himself became a miniature man with a small belly, baldness, and very red mustaches. He seemed to be cosplaying an adult uncle at a very young age, observing so many hypertrophied features. Everything went on like this until 2009. I'm sure Rick started what began to destroy our lives. He had a child. What I'm about to tell you next, believe it or not, but this is from the words of our mutual acquaintance. Rick's wife was told before birth that the child would be unhealthy. They performed a cesarean section. The child was put in storage. It lay there for no more than a few hours. When the nurse opened the chamber and touched the child, a cloud of green dust flew at her during the first touch. The child simply molded to death. Inside the diapers remained only skin. Rick's wife, seeing this, jumped out the window right there. The nurse was taken from there to the mental hospital. The police wrote that the child was stolen and opened a case. Of course, no one listened to the nurse. But the most interesting thing was what happened to Rick. First, he disappeared, and no one except his mother was looking for him. She kept trying to find locksmiths to open his apartment. A month later, she succeeded. Rick lived on the first floor in a dilapidated Khrushchev building, so when his mother entered inside, she didn't immediately understand where such a strong smell of dampness was coming from. And when she discovered a hole in the center of the hall, there was nothing to say. 60 feet deep into the earth, and at the bottom, no one and nothing. Neither Rick nor even an approximate object of search. How this affected me, that's when everything began. First, I started hearing vibrations behind the wall, then a hum similar to moaning choirs. This sound didn't let me sleep normally, and began to haunt me not only at home, but everywhere. Then one morning, when I was leaving for work, my door got stuck against something. Squeezing through it, I found the corpse of an old stray dog. Neighbors, like me, were a bit shocked. Together, we carried it outside, after which utility workers threw the corpse away. Returning from work, I again met neighbors on the landing. Now, by the threshold of my door lay 3 corpses, 2 cats, and 1 dog. We carried them out again, and in complete horror, I went home. That day I couldn't fall asleep, constantly hearing movements behind the walls and incomprehensible rustling behind the door, as if someone was weakly scratching. In the morning, under my door were already a dozen dead dogs and cats. After this, neighbors looked at me with suspicion. On the way to work, I sat down to smoke in one of the courtyards. Smoking, I saw an old dog slowly approaching me from behind, breathing heavily. He barely moved his paws and just approaching my feet, fell powerlessly. Still not understanding what had happened, I looked at the dead creature. I looked and a cat was already coming in my direction, swaying. Its black eyes looked at me with death. It also went limp, hitting my leg. And then I saw how from everywhere, old animals were coming toward me emaciated, skin-covered domestic pets. They reached my feet and died. Have you ever asked yourself where old animals go to die? I hope what happened to me isn't the answer. That day I started running and ran, until my legs brought me to Mayfield Village, to the house where my grandfather had lived out his last years. Only there did old animals not come to me to die. Only there did nothing live bigger than a beetle. This is the moment about spoilers at the beginning. I started living in this house. I feed myself with rare gifts of local nature. Of the benefits of civilization, I have only an old laptop on which I'm writing this. And now we move on to the strangest part. To somehow survive, I started robbing neighbors, breaking into their houses. And you know what I discovered there? Holes, deep holes going endlessly down. You've watched movies about burglars, how they beautifully pick locks there. Well, I didn't pick locks, I kicked down doors. 410 different houses with holes. How do you like that? Not a single living soul in the entire village, and now there's a war. Life really does have a sense of humor. But do you want the biggest creepiness for last? I had a file on my desktop where I was writing all this. When I finished, I cut it out, opened the disk where I went to the folder where I had photos and various personal stuff. And what did I discover? The same file. I opened it and found this whole story, word for word, only without the ending. Although I definitely didn't write it, it was there. There were days when we couldn't leave the yard. About 10 days each month, we were trapped. As a child, I couldn't recognize these days myself, but the adults could tell by their own mysterious signs. On such days, life went on as usual on the surface. Everyone entertained themselves loudly, talking, playing games. Grandpa Henry and Dad would pull out chess, checkers, and playing cards, turning on concerts on the television. Mom and Grandma Margaret would cook especially delicious meals and eat them in the backyard under the big old cherry tree. But there was something artificial about all these festivities, something fake. Mom and Grandma walked around pale with forced smiles. They talked about good things, but their eyes darted nervously. Dad and Grandpa tried to joke, but all their jokes were clumsy and awkward. When they had to leave the yard on such days, the only safe way to do it was by car. They prepared for this long, gloomily, and somehow mournfully. It saddened me that I wouldn't see my friends for 10 whole days. I even tried to disobey the rules and sneak out of the yard onto the street. After all, my friend Jake lived next door, just 2 minutes from his gate to ours. What could happen if I left the yard? I didn't make it. Mom spotted me in time and gave me a good beating. It was the only time in my life I was hit. After that, I never tested fate again and entertained myself with everything within our yard's radius, from the garden to the fence. Why we couldn't go out, I didn't know as a child. After that beating, I didn't really want to ask anymore. But from my parents' hushed conversations in the kitchen, I understood that there was someone out there on the street. And it wasn't the usual dogs and wolves you'd expect in rural areas, but something else entirely. From age 10, the fence also became a forbidden zone for me. It wasn't about punishment anymore. That day, my ball rolled toward the gate, and I ran after it. I remembered that right now we weren't supposed to leave the yard, but I wasn't planning to do that. I just needed to get my ball that had rolled to the fence, and then head back deep into the yard. It was such a beautiful day, birds were singing. The sun was shining, so I wasn't really thinking about anything bad. I ran up to the fence, grabbed my ball that had gotten stuck by the gate, and was about to rush back into the depths of the yard when I saw that right behind our fence stood a little girl in a headscarf tied under her chin. From under her forehead, she was looking at me. I was so struck by her unkind, piercing gaze that I froze in place, staring. Not even because she had left her yard to come out onto the street on such a day, and not because she was somehow standing behind our fence and looking into our yard, but because of the strange hatred in her eyes. The longer I looked at her, the more hideous her face seemed to me. And suddenly I realized that this wasn't a little girl at all, but some small, shorter than me, a 10-year-old, disgusting old woman. "Alex, what happened?" Mom shouted, looking out the window. I came to my senses, turned around, and ran to the house, pressing the ball to myself. As I ran, I managed to see that Mom was looking intently and tensely at the gate. When I ran into my parents' room, she was still standing by the window. I threw myself into her arms and started babbling. There was some strange old woman there. She was looking at us from the street. "Alex, what are you talking about? You must have imagined it," Mom replied gently and kissed me, pressing me to her. But I heard her heart pounding and remembered how she looked at the gate when I was running away. I realized she had seen everything. After this incident, nothing similar happened for a long time. But during those 10 days each month, I still avoided the fence and gate and generally tried to play only in the patch in the middle of the yard. I quickly noticed that all my relatives did the same. They didn't pick apples and pears from the trees growing near the fence, didn't trim the roses and grapes by the gate. More precisely, they did these things, but only when those 10 days ended and you could freely walk the streets and play wherever you wanted again. Thus, 2/3 of the month we lived normal lives, went to school, walked the streets, fished, gathered mushrooms in the forest. The other third, we sat at home. Only those who had their own cars could leave the yard. While you're in the car, nothing threatens you. But when on such days I asked Dad and Grandpa to go somewhere, they gloomily refused and said I might see all sorts of things. What exactly, I understood at 14. Usually during those 10 days, Mom and Grandma didn't leave the yard, but calmly worked in the garden that bordered our yard. Then they gave that up too. We were having dinner outside when I heard some strange sounds, like a cat trying to cough up fur, and saw everyone looking somewhere behind me in shock. I turned around and saw a bent-over old woman walking through our garden, jerking as if trying to hold back vomit. After taking a few more steps, she abruptly pressed her hands to her knees and vomited her own intestines right onto our strawberry patch. After throwing up about 6 feet of her intestines, she lifted her skirt, squatted over the bed, and the rest of her insides crawled out of her. After this, she stood up, brushed herself off, and slowly shuffled away. We never discussed this family event, avoiding it like something indecent. There were other incidents. For example, I remember how we sat in the yard until dusk, and then someone started knocking loudly at the gate. Turning around, I saw several people with pale faces standing behind the fence. All were short in stature. It was too dark to make out details, but I could see that one of them had stuck his head through a gap in the fence and was smiling. "Just don't look at them. They can't come in by themselves," Mom explained to me, and everyone turned back to laughter and conversation. But I glanced over there several more times, and all these people who had been there were climbing the fence, turning the handle, smiling at me. There was something else that same summer, but in July. I was picking apricots outside when I heard someone calling me. Turning toward the call, I saw Marcus standing behind the gate, a boy 3 years older than me from the neighboring street. "Alex, come out and play," he said. This seemed strange to me. We communicated with him but weren't very close friends and only saw each other in large groups. "But you can't go out on the street right now. I said carefully. There's nobody here. I've been walking around all these days and haven't seen anything. Let's go to Derek's and play computer games. Derek was the only boy in town who had a computer. On one hand, I didn't want to disobey my parents. Who knows what could happen on the street during these days? On the other hand, I didn't want to embarrass myself in front of an older boy. Marcus smiled encouragingly, and I saw that his teeth were somehow small and grew unevenly, one on top of another, as if in 3 rows. And his eyes, seemingly Marcus's black eyes, but somehow strangely crossed, as if looking slightly in different directions. I stopped. I was already close enough to see that this was someone who looked like Marcus, but wasn't him. "What's wrong?" asked the thing that looked like Marcus, still smiling. And his voice was somehow different, not his at all. I turned around and ran to the house. Looking back later, I saw that he hadn't left and was watching me with that same strange smile. There was another completely incomprehensible incident. I knew that if you're in a car, there's nothing to fear, especially if you drive the car straight into the yard and then quickly close the gate. But this didn't protect you from what you might see through the window. That day we urgently needed to go to town, and we went, Dad, Grandpa, and I on our way back. As we approached the house, I saw some boy walking through our yard, going out through the gate that was open for some reason, and walking toward us with his back facing forward. We stopped. The boy walked past us. I looked back and saw that it was me walking, smiling widely and wearing clothes I never owned. Dad and Grandpa saw nothing, or pretended to see nothing. When we got out of the car, I looked back again and saw the boy still walking away from us with his back forward, smiling and looking directly at me. The gate turned out to be closed. When I later asked Mom if she had seen anyone in our yard, she was surprised and said no. It wasn't just my doppelganger I saw. I was sitting at home once. The heat was terrible. All the relatives had scattered to their rooms to nap after lunch. Only Grandma was in the kitchen washing dishes, and I was watching TV. I heard some strange clicking from the window, like a person clicking their tongue. I looked out, and in the yard on the bench lay my grandfather, covering his eyes from the sun with his hand and sleeping. I turn my head. Grandpa is snoring in his room through the open door, clearly visible. I look out the window. Grandpa is lying there. I went to the kitchen and told Grandma. She got scared, started shouting, "It's starting again." Oh, I forgot everything. She dropped everything and ran to close all the windows and doors. Generally, it was accepted in our house, for this very reason, to always close the gates, even if nothing strange had happened for a long time. Because those strange people who sometimes walked the streets couldn't open even the most primitive gate without a latch or handle. But if it was open, they easily entered the yard. This is exactly what they usually sought to do. There were also attempts to lure me out of the house. For example, once Jake called our house and invited me to hang out. I said that it was better not to walk the streets right now. Then he said, "Let me come to you, we'll watch TV at your place. Come out, I'm already approaching." Indeed, after hanging up and going out on the porch, I saw Jake already standing behind the gate. A thought flashed through my head. How did he get here so fast? And I stopped. "Well, how much longer?" he shouted. "Come in, why are you standing there?" "You open the gate for me first," I replied loudly. "Just push it and come in." "Is it difficult or what? Can't you just open the gate for me?" "Your damn latch is stuck, don't you understand? I can't get in." I turned around and silently went back into the house. There were no latches on our gate. After this, Jake and Derek called me several more times, trying to lure me outside during the bad days. But they were all exposed through the gate test, although usually they easily came into our yard. Later they became smarter. They called me to come to their houses, and when I refused to come, they got angry and cursed me out with choice words. I wasn't worried about this because my real friends received the same calls supposedly from me, and I couldn't go to their yards either. Strange incidents happened more often in warm weather. Or maybe I just remembered it that way. I remember only one incident that happened in winter. We were having breakfast in the kitchen when we heard someone's shuffling steps in the yard and loud, hoarse coughing. "Someone came," Mom said, and getting up from the table, went to the window from which our yard was clearly visible. She immediately cried out, turned pale, and quickly pulled the curtains shut. I forgot to close the gate, Dad realized. Everyone jumped up and began pulling curtains on all the windows in the house. For 24 hours we sat in front of the TV, which drowned out the steps, coughing, knocking at doors and windows that, by the way, were much higher than human height because there was a garage under our house. The next morning, everything stopped. What could have happened if you let yourself be lured out of the house or yard, or met one of these strange people on the street? I didn't know for sure. But I repeatedly heard about the tragedy that happened to a girl from our village. Her name was either Helen or Evelyn, and she lived on the neighboring street. She was walking with a child and saw something that made her run away in fear, abandoning her baby in the stroller. She came home in tears. Her husband, parents, and neighbors immediately gathered together and went to the place where she had left the child. But they found only an empty stroller. Further searches for the child were unsuccessful, and then this family left their house and drove away from the village forever. What did this woman see that scared her so much that she ran away, abandoning her baby? My parents refused to say. They generally told me nothing about this. The only thing I understood from overheard conversations was that all these strange people came from the ravine that began right behind our street. If you see black smoke coming from the ravine, or it seems to you that trees are burning and falling there, it means they'll start walking again soon, and it's time to close the yard. And you could never leave the gate open, even if nothing strange had happened for a long time. Somehow, when I was at home, a neighbor called our landline and asked, "Alex, is your gate not closed?" "I don't know. What's wrong?" I replied. "Well, your mother and I are sitting drinking tea in the kitchen, and some woman who looks like her is walking around your yard." I looked out the window and indeed saw my mother walking around the yard in some strange, dirty, as if stolen sweater. Sometimes she stopped, bent down, and began digging in the earth with her hands. And then I heard my mother's voice behind me. "Son, close all the doors and don't open them if someone knocks. She'll leave on her own." I can't say that what was happening scared me very much. Sometimes it happened that on days when you couldn't leave the yard, I would deliberately sit on the windowsill, waiting to see something unusual through the window. Often I could see Mom or Grandma and Grandpa walking down the street, while I heard their voices from the next room and knew they were at home. Sometimes you could see our relatives working in our or the neighbors' gardens, relatives who lived in another town, and who, in principle, couldn't be here. Once I saw myself knocking at the gate and calling for Mom to let me into the yard. But most often I saw fires in the ravine that, as Mom explained to me, weren't really there. I saw black smoke and tongues of flame in the distance, but understood that they weren't really there, and it was an amazing feeling. I also saw a black sedan that drove through the streets, but more often through the ravine. When it passed by our house, I could see that there was no one in it. Grandma once let slip that back in Soviet times, city people came to the ravine in such a black sedan to rest, got drunk, and started a fire. Part of the forest burned down. People and animals died. Since then, the ravine burns periodically, and this car still drives around. It was this sedan that was connected to the incident, after which my parents firmly decided to leave. Then nothing had happened for a long time. Children played freely on the streets. Jake, Derek, and I even went to that same ravine, but found nothing interesting there. Many people thought it was all over. But then suddenly, the same black sedan without a driver appeared, and at full speed ran down a group of playing children, killed 2 little boys, and disappeared. If earlier people somehow tolerated what was happening, not wanting to leave familiar places, the death of children was the last straw. My mother had already given birth to my little brother Tommy by that time, and it was decided to change our place of residence for the baby's safety. True, this took more than a year, and for a long time we were still bothered by the boys killed by the sedan who walked the streets after their funeral and called my brother to come out and play. But eventually, we managed to leave this place. I can say that the described events didn't affect my psyche at all. At 17, thanks to some benefits and my own decent studies, I was able to enter college on a budget, which got me a room in the city dormitory. Dad later managed to find a good job in the same city, so parents and Tommy soon moved there too. Grandpa, unfortunately, is no longer alive, but according to Grandma, this is hardly noticeable. She, as before, sometimes sees him sleeping in the yard or sees him walking down the street from the window, so she's not lonely. The old Chevy pickup truck that Jake affectionately called his workhorse, but which looked more like a rust bucket on wheels, groaned painfully as it climbed the broken mountain road. Branches scraped against the sides with a dry scratching sound like skeletal fingers trying to stop them. Inside, it smelled of gasoline, wet earth, and something else. Something stale that had soaked into the upholstery from hundreds of similar trips to dead, God-forsaken places. Behind the wheel sat Jake, his hands covered with a network of old scars, gripping the steering wheel confidently, keeping the truck from sliding into the deep rut filled with brown water. A former Marine, he had maintained his posture and habit of looking at the world as a potential battlefield, even in civilian life. Each expedition for him was not entertainment, but an operation requiring planning, discipline, and sober risk assessment. He was silent, and this silence was heavier than any order. Next to him in the passenger seat sat Amber. She was the brain of their small team. In her backpack there were always maps, printouts from archives, old photographs, and a flashlight with spare batteries. She wasn't interested in ghosts or thrills. She was interested in history frozen in dust and decay. She looked out the window at the flickering trunks of dead pines, her face concentrated and slightly sad, as if she was already mourning this place. In the back, on the bouncing seats, sat the complete opposite of the first two. Tyler, with an eternal grin on his face and an action camera strapped to his head, was an adrenaline junkie and part-time influencer blogger. For him, all this was content. Every crack in the wall, every creaking door was a potential shot for spectacular editing. "Jake, man, you found one hell of a road," he shouted over the engine noise. "My subscribers are gonna lose their minds. Survival in post-apocalyptic America, exclusive content. How's that for a title?" Jake glanced at him briefly in the rearview mirror. "The title will be How We Drowned the Chevy in a Swamp Because Someone Can't Sit Quietly. If you don't stop distracting me." Next to Tyler, pressed into the corner, sat Mia. She was here for the first time, Tyler's girlfriend, whom he had been persuading for a week to come along for real adventure. Her big, frightened eyes were the best indicator of the atmosphere. She looked either at the impenetrable wall of forest outside the window or at her boyfriend, who was acting as if they were going on a picnic and couldn't understand what to fear more, this creepy place or his recklessness. "Are we almost there?" she asked quietly, more to herself than anyone else. "Almost, babe," Tyler hugged her shoulders. "Look, there's gonna be an epic view in a second. Jake, stop for a moment on that hill." Jake, ignoring the request, brought the truck to a small clearing and killed the engine. The ensuing silence was deafening. It was thick and viscous, filled only with the rustle of wind in dead crowns. And ahead, in the distance, drowning in purple twilight, stood Pine Valley Psychiatric Hospital. The building was monstrous. A massive concrete monster built in the era of institutional gigantism. It now resembled the skeleton of a prehistoric animal that had fallen in the middle of the forest. Dozens of dark window sockets looked at them with silent reproach. The plaster had fallen off, exposing brickwork that looked like rotting flesh. And around it, the forest wasn't just abandoned, it was dead. The pines stood bare and black, their branches reaching toward the gray sky like the arms of drowned men. "Whoa," Tyler breathed, pointing his camera at the building. "This is just incredible, guys. You see this scale? This is gonna be my best video ever." "It looks sick," Mia whispered. "That's exactly what it was," Amber confirmed, not taking her eyes off the hospital. In the late 70s, they converted it. They brought people with rare neurological disorders from all over the country. They said the mountain air, saturated with pine, worked miracles. "Doesn't look like it," Tyler chuckled. "The trees apparently got treated too and didn't recover. Something went wrong." Amber took out a yellowed newspaper clipping from her folder. In 1983, the hospital was urgently closed. Official reason: violation of sanitary standards and emergency condition of the building. But there were rumors about some outbreak of an unknown infection. All documents were classified, and the place was cordoned off for several years. "Infection is even better," Tyler rejoiced. "Ghosts, mutants, and secret CIA experiments. Folks, we hit the jackpot." "Stop it," Jake cut him off. He had already gotten out of the truck and was surveying the perimeter with binoculars. If there was an infection, even 40 years later, spores of some nasty stuff could still be active. From this moment on, respirators stay on. Don't touch anything with bare hands. Stay together. Tyler, this especially concerns you. No heroics for the camera. Clear. Tyler theatrically saluted. "Yes, Captain." They grabbed their backpacks and headed toward the main entrance. The closer they got, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air became dense, smelling of mold, wet earth, and something elusive Swedish, like the smell of wilted flowers in a closed room. The main entrance with collapsed columns was welded shut with a thick sheet of iron. "Going around, looking for a back door," Jake commanded. They walked along the wall, shuffling their feet through a carpet of rotten pine needles. Mia flinched at every crack underfoot, expecting someone or something to come around the corner at any moment. Tyler, on the contrary, enthusiastically looked into every broken window, commenting on camera. And here, apparently, was the cafeteria. Imagine patients are sitting here, eating their oatmeal, and outside the window is a zombie apocalypse. The needed entrance was found on the back side of the building. The door to the laundry room had been torn off its hinges and lay nearby. Behind it, a black gap yawned, pulling with grave cold. "Well, God be with us," Jake muttered, turning on his powerful headlamp. Its beam snatched from the darkness a piece of corridor with peeling green paint on the walls and piles of moldy laundry on the floor. They went inside. Outside, the sunset painted the sky blood red, but here inside, night had already fallen. Inside, the hospital turned out to be even more terrifying than outside. It was huge and empty, and this emptiness hummed, pressed on the ears. Their steps echoed hollowly under high ceilings, mixing with the quiet rustle of crumbling plaster and the creaking of drafts in endless corridors. The beams of their flashlights darted along the walls, snatching ghostly silhouettes from the gloom, overturned gurneys, broken medical cabinets, medical records scattered on the floor. "We'll set up base on the second floor," Jake decided. "Away from the main entrance, and the windows are intact, less drafty." They climbed the wide main staircase. The twisted metal of the banister was covered with a thick layer of rust that looked like dried blood. The second floor greeted them with the same desolation. A long corridor stretched in both directions, disappearing into darkness. The doors of the wards were wide open, like mute mouths. "Perfect," Tyler said, surveying the spacious hall in the center of the floor. "Good view and plenty of space. We could even start a little fire." "No fires," Jake cut him off. "We don't need to start a fire or attract the wrong kind of attention." While the men were choosing a place to camp, Amber, true to her nature, had already separated from the group. Her beam slid over the nameplates on the doors. "Ward number 12, head nurse, treatment room." She pushed the door with the nameplate nurse's station. The room was small, cluttered with papers. On the table stood an old rotary phone, and next to it lay a syringe in a glass package. Amber shone her light on a shelf filled with empty vials and medicine boxes. On one of the shelves, her attention was caught by a gray cardboard folder, almost blending with the dust. She carefully took it, blew off the dust, and opened it. Inside lay a stack of yellowed, brittle papers. Duty schedules, medication requests, incident reports. Standard bureaucracy. But among them was one sheet that differed from the rest. It was typed on a typewriter, on thicker paper, and hadn't yellowed as much as the others. At the top, in bold type, was printed, "Behavioral protocols, for duty nurse night shift." She felt a chill run down her spine. She began to read. "Guys, come here," she called, not taking her eyes off the sheet. "I think I found something." Jake, Tyler, and Mia entered the nurse's station. "What's there?" "An evacuation plan in case of nuclear war," Tyler joked, pointing his camera at Amber. "Almost." Amber raised serious eyes to them. "It's some kind of instruction. Listen." She cleared her throat and began to read aloud. Her voice in the silence of the room sounded unusually loud and solemn. Point 1. Conduct ward rounds at the beginning of each hour. Begin rounds from the east wing. Standard, Jake commented. Point 2. Avoid treatment room number 4 after midnight. The door to the room must always be locked with 2 turns of the key. Mia shivered. Tyler smirked. Oh, here come the scary stories. Probably the head doctor was groping nurses there, so they made up a boogeyman. Amber ignored him and continued. Point 3. Upon hearing sounds of dry, intermittent coughing from an empty ward, do not turn around, do not enter, and do not attempt to establish the source of the sound. Quicken pace and continue rounds. Now even Tyler stopped smiling. In the dead silence of the hospital, the mere thought of coughing from an empty room caused goosebumps. Point 4. Amber's voice became quieter. Upon light signal call from an empty bed, immediately proceed to the source. You have exactly 60 seconds to deactivate the call by pressing the button again on the panel at the head of the bed. Failure to follow protocol is unacceptable. She fell silent, having finished reading. For several seconds, everyone stood in silence, digesting what they had heard. Nonsense, Tyler was the first to break the silence, but his voice was no longer so confident. He laughed nervously. Local folklore, probably. They scared new nurses so they wouldn't sleep on duty. Amber, give it here. I'll film it for the blog. He took the sheet from her and began to theatrically read it on camera, making faces and depicting horror. Jake frowned. His gaze was fixed on the last point. I don't like this, he said quietly. Any safety instruction, especially in old government institutions, wasn't written on empty ground, usually after some incident, written in blood. Come on, Jake, Tyler waved dismissively, finishing filming. What calls? There's been no electricity here for 40 years. Where would they come from? The Holy Spirit. Maybe some autonomous system, Amber suggested. Emergency power. Some facilities were built that way. In any case, Jake summed up, we stay away from those buttons. And from the 4th treatment, room 2, just in case. They returned to the hall and began unpacking their backpacks. They got out sleeping bags, thermoses with hot tea, food. Twilight outside the window was finally replaced by impenetrable darkness. The wind howled in the pipes, and it seemed as if the huge building was breathing, sighing in its sleep. They tried to speak louder than usual to drown out this oppressive silence, but it didn't work well. Tension hung in the air. They decided to do a first round to look around and make sure they were alone in the building. Jake walked ahead, lighting the way with a powerful flashlight. Behind him were Amber and Mia. Tyler brought up the rear, filming everything. They went through the entire 2nd floor, looking into empty wards. Everywhere was the same picture. Rusty beds with spring meshes, nightstands overturned on the floor, scraps of dirty mattresses. The air was heavy with the smell of dust and medicine. Let's go up to the 3rd, Amber suggested. According to the plan, there was a ward for the most severe patients. Go ahead, Jake nodded. The 3rd floor was even gloomier. The corridor here was narrower and longer, and most of it was filled with empty beds arranged in 2 rows, as if waiting for new patients. They created an eerie labyrinth of rusty metal. They walked slowly through this corridor, maneuvering between the beds. The beams of their flashlights picked out first one, then another rusty spring from the darkness. They squeaked quietly from the draft. Creepy little place, Mia whispered, pressing against Tyler. I feel like we're being watched. Relax, it's just imagination, Tyler answered cheerfully, though he himself kept looking around. They had almost reached the middle of the corridor when, about 100 yards ahead of them, they ran into a massive door with the nameplate Intensive Care Unit. And then it happened. At the very far end of the corridor, almost at the door to the unit, on one of the beds standing against the wall, a soft, dim red light flashed. It didn't blink, but burned with a steady, sick light like a smoldering coal. Simultaneously, a sound was heard, quiet, rattling like the chirp of a cicada. A bell. All four froze like statues, and their flashlights crossed on the source of light. A red light bulb on an old Soviet call panel above the bed. Silence. Only this quiet, monotonous sound and steady red light in absolute darkness. Tyler swallowed, and then the familiar grin appeared on his face again. He slowly took out his phone and turned on the stopwatch. Numbers ran across the screen. 1, 2. Well, folks, his voice sounded unnaturally loud. Time's up. 60 seconds. Who's the fastest? Let's test the local legend. The seconds on Tyler's phone screen dripped in the deafening silence, broken only by the rattling of the bell. 5, 6, 7. The red light at the end of the corridor hypnotized, drew the eye. It seemed like the only living point in this kingdom of death. Tyler, turn it off, Amber hissed. Are you out of your mind? Mia echoed her. Her voice trembled. But Tyler only gripped his phone tighter. His eyes burned with excitement. 10 seconds, guys. We'll just see what happens. This is so cool. Jake said nothing. He looked at the distant light, and his face was like a stone mask. Pragmatism fought with instinct. On one hand, nonsense, urban legend, faulty wiring. On the other, an instruction written in blood and rule, number one of any survivalist. If you don't know how a trap works, it's better to consider it real. On the 15th second, he made a decision. Stay here, he threw briefly and took off. He didn't run, he bolted like he hadn't run since army training. His heavy boots thudded dully on the concrete floor. He wasn't just running down the corridor, he was racing through an obstacle course. The beam of his headlamp flashed, picking rusty bed backs, protruding mattress springs, piles of broken brick from the darkness. He jumped over trash, pushed off walls to not lose speed on turns. Tyler, Amber, and Mia froze, following him with their eyes. On Tyler's camera, now only the distant, shaking light of his flashlight was visible. 25 seconds, Tyler shouted after him. Jake's breathing was labored, his lungs burned. 100 meters in a straight line is one thing. 100 meters through a corridor cluttered with junk in complete darkness is quite another. He saw only a narrow tunnel of light in front of him, and the distant red dot that seemed not to be getting closer. The rattling bell became louder, more insistent. It crawled into his ears, into his brain. 40 seconds, came Tyler's cry. Jake was already within 20 meters. He could see the call panel old, made of yellow plastic with a big red button in the middle, above which the light bulb was burning. He made the final dash, almost tripping over an overturned gurney. 50, Tyler's voice cracked. Even he was beginning to realize this was no longer a game. Jake flew up to the bed. His hand shot forward. He hit the button with all his strength with his palm. There was a loud click. The red light went out. The rattling bell cut off mid-sound. Absolute, ringing silence fell. Jake stood breathing heavily, leaning his hands on his knees. Sweat flooded his eyes. He slowly straightened and shone his flashlight on the bed. Empty. Just a dirty, crumpled mattress. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. He turned around. At the far end of the corridor, 3 silhouettes loomed. "All clear," he shouted. His voice echoed through the floor. He walked back, no longer hurrying, carefully looking around. When he approached the others, his face was gloomier than a storm cloud. "I told you," he exhaled, looking straight at Tyler. "No games." "Come on, Jake. You were magnificent," Tyler laughed nervously, lowering his phone. "Just a rocket, made it, hero." "That wasn't a game, idiot," Jake growled, grabbing him by the hand. "What if I hadn't made it? What then? Did you think about that?" Hey, let go." Tyler broke free. "Nothing would have happened, just the light bulb would have gone out. Short circuit, that's all." Mia was crying quietly, soundlessly. Tears just flowed down her cheeks. Amber approached Jake and put her hand on his shoulder. "It's okay. He made it. Let's go downstairs." They went down to the second floor, to their improvised camp. No one was joking anymore. Everyone silently drank tea from thermoses, listening to every rustle. The incident had shaken them. What seemed like a scary story on paper had become reality in the form of a red light and a 60-second timer. About 10 minutes passed. The tension began to subside slightly. "Maybe it's just the notification system glitching," Mia suggested, trying to find a rational explanation. "Old, so it's shorting out." "Possibly," Amber agreed, though there was no confidence in her voice. At that moment, they heard it again. A quiet, rattling ring. This time it came from somewhere to the left, from another wing of the building. They looked at each other. Jake slowly got up and approached the window facing the inner courtyard. In a window on the first floor of the opposite wing, a red light was burning. "Damn," Jake swore. To get there, they would have to go down to the first floor, cross the debris-filled inner courtyard, and find an entrance to that wing. But that wasn't the worst part. The staircase leading to that part of the building had collapsed. The only way lay through a narrow ledge along the outer wall. "Can't get there in a minute," Amber stated, paling. Tyler took out his phone again. The stopwatch was already running. 13 seconds have passed, he said quietly. They looked at the distant red light like a death sentence. It burned steadily and inexorably. "What are we gonna do?" Mia whispered. Jake looked at Tyler. "You're our athlete," he said without any irony. "Extreme blogger." Tyler swallowed. All his feigned bravado evaporated. He looked either at the distant light or at the collapsed staircase. I can't. There's a ledge. It might collapse." 50 seconds, Amber pronounced like a judge. And then Jake did what no one expected from him. He grabbed a heavy metal thermos from the table. "Get away from the window," he shouted and swung with all his might, hurling the thermos at the window facing the courtyard. The glass shattered with a deafening crash into thousands of pieces. Without losing a second, Jake jumped onto the windowsill. "Jake, no," Amber screamed, but he was already outside. He grabbed the drain pipe and crawled down like a lizard. The pipe creaked, tearing rusty brackets from the wall. He jumped to the ground from a 10-foot height, landing successfully on bent legs, and ran. He raced across the debris-filled courtyard, jumping over chunks of concrete and rebar. He ran up to the wall of the other wing, found the ledge with his eyes. It was a narrow protrusion, no wider than his boot. He climbed up. 58 came Tyler's desperate cry. Jake was already at the window. He looked inside. The red button was burning right in front of him, about 10 feet away. He punched the glass with his fist, breaking it, ignoring the cuts, stuck his hand inside, and with his last strength reached for the button. Click, the light went out. The ringing stopped. Jake remained hanging on the ledge, breathing heavily. He looked at his hand. It was bloody. In the window opposite stood his comrades. Their faces were pale with horror and relief. The game had begun, and the rules in it were not on their side. The night turned into an exhausting, insane marathon. The system, or whatever it was, gave them no respite. Every 10 to 15 minutes, somewhere in some part of the huge hospital, a red light would come on and the countdown would begin. The third call happened in the basement, in the former boiler room. They had to squeeze through a narrow crawl space cluttered with pipes. The fourth, on the roof, reached only by a flimsy, rusty ladder. The fifth in the kitchen, in a huge refrigerator whose door was jammed, and Jake had to knock it out with his shoulder. They were exhausted physically and mentally. Each new run took strength, and the short breaks were filled not with rest, but with anxious anticipation of a new call. They divided responsibilities. Jake and Tyler, as the fastest and most enduring, ran. Amber, using her knowledge of the building layout, plotted the shortest routes for them. Mia gave water, bandaged scratches, and watched the stopwatch with horror. Tyler had changed. Not a trace remained of his initial cheerfulness. Now he ran silently, with clenched teeth. The adrenaline he had so craved turned out to be bitter to taste. This wasn't entertainment, not content for a blog. This was grueling work, where the price of error was the unknown, frightening far more than any ghost. His camera was still recording, but he no longer commented, just documented their race through hell. During one of these breaks, when Jake was breathing heavily, treating another cut on his hand, Amber stepped aside. She couldn't shake the thought that they were missing something important. This couldn't be just a system malfunction. There was logic in this, cruel, incomprehensible, but logic. "I'm going away, need to check something." "Don't go alone," Jake immediately reacted. "I won't go far, to the chief doctor's office. It's here in this same wing. I want to find at least some documents, journals, reports. There must be an explanation." Jake hesitated but understood her rightness. They couldn't run forever. Sooner or later they wouldn't make it. They needed information. 10 minutes. If you don't come back, we're coming after you. Take the radio." "Okay." While the men tried to catch their breath, Amber, armed with a flashlight and radio, headed to the chief doctor's office. The door of solid oak was not locked. Inside reigned relative order, as if the owner had just stepped out for a minute. A massive desk, leather chair, bookcases filled with medical reference books. On the wall hung a portrait of some bearded scientist. Amber began methodically searching the desk. Empty folders, stationery, a dried inkwell. Nothing. She moved to the cabinets. Reference books, monographs, bound volumes of health magazine. And suddenly, on the very bottom shelf, behind a stack of old newspapers, she felt something hard. It was a thick journal in leather binding without any inscriptions. She put it on the table, blew off the dust, and opened it. This was a personal diary, or rather a work journal. The handwriting was small, beaded, and obviously belonged to a pedantic person. Amber skimmed the first page. Records about equipment, staff changes. Boring. She began leafing further, to dates close to the hospital's closure. And here the nature of the entries changed. March 12, 1983. A new group of patients arrived from Denver. Atypical symptomatology: apathy, muscle rigidity, but brain scans show clean neural pathways. Professor Martinez from Johns Hopkins suggested an unknown neurotropic pathogen by phone. I insist on complete quarantine of the group in the West Wing. Amber felt her heart begin to beat faster. March 21st, 1983. First fatality. Patient K died in his sleep at night. Remarkably, autopsy showed no pathology compatible with death. Cardiac arrest, but the strangest thing began after. Nurse Williams claims that the signal lamp above the deceased's bed spontaneously lit up an hour after death was declared. I attributed it to her fatigue and faulty wiring. March 24th, 1983. 2 more deaths. Same picture and again spontaneous signals. This time I saw it myself. Steady red light and quiet ringing. Lasted about a minute, then stopped. Electricians swear the system is de-energized and running only on backup generator, which was turned off. This is impossible. April 2nd, 1983. We're losing them one by one. Professor's theory from Boston seems increasingly real. This isn't a virus in the conventional sense. It's something affecting the nervous system. It doesn't destroy tissue, it rewrites it. And after the carrier's death, it leaves a residual trace. Like an echo. He called it residual psychoelectrical activity, an electrical impulse that nests in synapses, and after death the body tries to restart the system. Like a phantom limb, only at the level of the entire central nervous system. Amber recoiled from the journal in horror. She understood. These weren't ghosts. This wasn't a curse. This was quarantine. She frantically turned several more pages. April 15th, 1983. We developed a protocol. It turned out this residual impulse is extremely unstable. It forms in approximately 60 seconds. At this moment, it's vulnerable. A direct electrical discharge delivered through that signal system nullifies it, disperses it. He reconfigured the call buttons. Now a repeat press delivers a short high-voltage pulse. It works, but we must be in time. If we're not in time, the professor believes that in 60 seconds the activity stabilizes, forms into something stable. What will happen then, he doesn't know. No one knows. He calls it a breach of containment conditions. April 28th. The system works. Nurses run around at night like wound-up toys, turning off phantom calls. But we're losing. The disease is spreading. I locked treatment room number 4. We conducted experiments there with direct activity suppression. Something went wrong. Mirrors they somehow amplify, reflect this effect, create resonance. Now there's a constant, inexhaustible focus there. We can't suppress it. I ordered the door to be bricked up from inside. No one approach. May 5th, an order came from above. Full evacuation of personnel. The facility is being mothballed. We're all being transferred under non-disclosure agreements. And the patients are ordered to be left, and the system is to be left on. This isn't a hospital. This is a sarcophagus. God, what have we done? The last entry. Amber sat clutching the journal. Cold sweat ran down her back. Now everything fell into place. The rule about ward rounds to notice the signal in time. Coughing from an empty room, probably the first acoustic sign of forming activity. Don't turn around to not fall under psychoelectrical influence. Treatment room number 4, the place where the experiment got out of control. And 60 seconds. 60 seconds to prevent the formation of something greater. She grabbed the radio. "Jake, Tyler, do you hear me? Over." "I hear you," Jake responded. "What do you have?" "I understand everything," Amber blurted out. Her voice was breaking. "These aren't ghosts. This is quarantine. The buttons, they're not calls, they're resets. We must be in time. We're not letting something form." Silence fell on the radio. Then Tyler's voice was heard. "What nonsense are you talking about? What formation?" "I found the chief doctor's journal. Everything's written here. Some disease. It leaves electrical echo after death, and we suppress it by pressing buttons. 60 seconds, that's the time it takes to become stable." She hadn't finished speaking when the familiar rattling ring spread throughout the floor. It came from the hall where she had left the guys. "Damn," Jake's voice came through the radio. "We have a new call, right here, 60 feet away." Amber ran out of the office. She saw Tyler already taking off and running down the corridor. She ran to Jake and Mia. "We must be in time, whatever it costs," Amber shouted. Tyler ran up to the bed and forcefully pressed the button. Click. Silence. He returned, breathing heavily. "Stabilizes," he muttered, looking at Amber. "Into what does it stabilize?" No one knew the answer, but now their fear had acquired a new, even more terrible form. They were not just uninvited guests in a haunted house. They were staff who had involuntarily taken on the night shift in hell. They were the last barrier holding back something that had been waiting 40 years for its hour, behind a 60-second wall. Amber's discovery changed everything. Now each call was perceived not as an accident, but as a ticking bomb. They no longer asked what would happen if they failed. They knew that failure was unacceptable. The fear of the unknown was replaced by horror before a quite concrete threat, even if not fully understood. They ran again and again. Surgical ward, pediatric wing, where small beds stood in neat rows, causing especially oppressive feelings. Cafeteria, where they had to climb over overturned tables. Each run was at the limit. Strength was running out. Hands and feet were beaten bloody. It was Tyler, the one who had started all this for spectacular footage, who noticed the terrible pattern. He sat on the floor leaning against the wall and was reviewing the last recordings on his camera's small screen. He rewound, looked at his own comments, at the panic in Mia's eyes, at Jake's concentrated face. "Guys," he called quietly. His voice was hoarse from fatigue. Jake and Amber approached him. Mia was sleeping restlessly, curled up in her sleeping bag. "Look," Tyler tapped his finger on the screen. "This is the first call. 3rd floor, east wing. Here's the 2nd. 1st floor, west wing. 3rd, basement. 4th, attic. 5th, 6th, 7th. He quickly fast-forwarded through the video, stopping at moments where the camera recorded the location of the next button. "They're not random," he whispered. "I thought it was chaos, but it's not." Amber took the camera from him and also began to watch. Jake frowned, trying to understand what he was getting at. "What do you mean?" "Root," Tyler exhaled. "It's building a root, look. The first call was far away, the second even farther but in a different direction. The 3rd made us go down, the 4th go up to the very top. It's making us rush around the entire building, use all possible paths, stairs, ledges, crawl spaces." "It's studying us," Amber guessed, raising frightened eyes to him. "It's testing our capabilities, our speed, endurance, escape routes." Tyler nodded. His face was pale. All his self-confidence had disappeared, replaced by primitive horror of realization. "It's playing with us," he whispered. His voice trembled. "It's not just trying to break through. It's smart. It analyzes, and it's leading us somewhere." He took the camera from Amber, connected it to a small tablet, and opened the hospital plan that Amber had photographed earlier. With trembling fingers, he began marking the call points on the plan. First, second, third. When he connected them with lines, all three of them gasped. This wasn't a straight line or chaotic web. This was a spiral. A narrowing spiral that with each new loop, with each new call, inexorably led them to one point. Up 4th floor, to the infamous West Wing. Right to the door with the nameplate Treatment Room Number 4. "The mirror room," Amber whispered, remembering the journal entry. "Constant, inexhaustible focus." "It's driving us into a trap," Jake said. His voice was calm, but cold fury stood in his eyes. "It wants us to end up there." At that moment, Mia stirred in her sleep and mumbled something unintelligible. They fell silent, looking at her. She was the most vulnerable. She was the reason they couldn't just turn around and leave. They couldn't abandon her here. "What do we do?" Tyler asked. Despair sounded in his voice. "We can't stop running, but if we continue, we'll come straight into the jaws of this thing." Jake got up and paced around the hall. He was cornered. For the first time in all his practice, he didn't see the right solution. Any choice led to catastrophe. And then, as if mocking their helplessness, the ringing sounded. A new call. They looked at each other and checked the plan. 4th floor, main hall. This was the next loop of the spiral. The main hall was a huge room with a high ceiling, once used for physical therapy and evening events. But now it represented a deadly trap. Several years ago, the roof had collapsed in it, and with it part of the floor, forming a huge chasm that divided the hall into two parts. They climbed to the 4th floor and looked into the hall. The rattling ring and red light came from the opposite side of the gap, about 100 feet from them. Getting there was impossible. Jumping was unrealistic. The only bridge of rot, boards that someone had once thrown across the chasm, had long since fallen down. Going around through other rooms meant making a detour of several hundred meters. It would take at least 5 minutes, maybe more. They had no chance. Tyler turned on the stopwatch again, just out of habit. 10 seconds, 20 seconds. They stood at the edge of the chasm and silently looked at the red light. It burned as steadily and indifferently as all the previous ones. The ringing monotonously counted down the seconds of their defeat. 30 seconds. "And what now?" Mia whispered, who had woken up from the noise and climbed up with them. 40 seconds. Jake was silent. He was running through all the options in his head, but found not a single one. They were trapped. Game over. 50 seconds. Tyler raised his phone so everyone could see the screen. 59, 60. The screen flashed the number 1 minute. The red light on the other side blinked one last time and went out with a quiet, barely audible click. The ringing stopped, and nothing happened. Absolute, complete silence fell. No explosions, no monsters crawling out of the walls, no screams, just silence. They stood for several more seconds, expecting something, but nothing happened. Tyler laughed nervously, choked. "And that's it," he giggled hysterically. "Seriously, this is what we were afraid of," he looked at Jake, at Amber. "We ran so much, risked so much, for nothing, it turns out. It was just a glitch. The light bulb burned out. The relief that should have come didn't come. Instead, there was bewilderment and an even deeper, underlying fear." This silence, this nothing was scarier than any scream. It was wrong. "I don't know," Amber said quietly, "but I don't like this." "What could you not like?" Tyler exclaimed. His bravado had been swept over by another wave, this time hysterical. "It's over, finished, comedy, we're free. I'm not running anywhere else." Jake said nothing. He just looked into the darkness on the other side of the hall where the light had just been burning. He didn't believe in such simple solutions. He felt it with his skin. This wasn't the end. This was something else. "That's enough for us," he said finally. His voice was firm. "Pack up, we're leaving right now." The decision to leave was made unanimously and without discussion. Fear, fatigue, and nervous exhaustion had reached their limit. Even Tyler, who had just been bragging about his victory over the glitchy system, hurriedly packed his equipment, trying not to look into dark corners. The silence after the failed call pressed harder than any ringing. It was unnatural, like the calm before a storm. They quickly folded their modest camp on the second floor, threw empty bottles and wrappers into their backpacks. Every movement seemed too loud. Every rustle echoed in their ears. They moved quickly, almost running, driven by one desire: to get outside as soon as possible into fresh air, away from this concrete tomb. Their path to the main staircase lay through that same main hall on the 4th floor where they had suffered defeat. They could have gone around, but it would have taken longer, and no one wanted to stay here a second longer than necessary. "Stay together," Jake commanded when they approached the hall doors. "Go through quickly, don't stop. Tyler, no improvisation." They entered the hall. The huge space was drowning in gloom. Only narrow strips of moonlight fell from the hole in the roof, drawing bizarre patterns on the floor. The gap in the center of the hall yawned like a wound. They walked along the wall, trying to stay as far as possible from the place on the opposite side where that bed was located. They walked single file, Jake in front, then Amber, then Tyler, and Mia brought up the rear. They had almost crossed the hall. No more than 30 feet remained to the saving door leading to the staircase, and then Mia stopped. She didn't cry out, didn't call for help. She just froze in place, as if her legs had grown into the floor. This happened just at the moment when she was passing by an imaginary line drawn from the bed with the failed call. Tyler, walking ahead, turned around. "Mia, come on, hurry up." She didn't answer. She stood absolutely motionless, facing the group, but her gaze was directed somewhere to the side, at an empty place by the far wall. Her face in the dim moonlight was waxy and devoid of any emotion. "Mia," Tyler approached her and carefully touched her shoulder. "Hey, you scared me. Let's go." She slowly, very slowly, like a broken doll, turned her head toward him. Her eyes were wide open but empty. There was no fear, no recognition, nothing in them. And then she spoke. Her voice made blood freeze in the veins of all three. This wasn't her voice. It was even, devoid of intonation, almost mechanical. Alien, clinically calm. "Patient has awakened," pronounced the thing that looked like Mia. "Care required." Tyler recoiled from her like from fire. "Mia, what are you saying?" "Containment protocol breached," she continued in the same lifeless voice, looking through Tyler. "Energy signature stabilized. Treatment required." At this moment, the terrible truth reached them. They understood what it really meant to not make it in time. The entity, or disease, or whatever it was, hadn't disappeared. It hadn't evaporated. It had stabilized. In those 60 seconds, it had formed and anchored in this place, creating an invisible, inaudible infection zone. And Mia, passing through it, had become its first carrier, the new nurse for this disease. "Run," Jake shouted, realizing everything before the others. But it was too late. Nurse Mia took a step toward them. Her movements were smooth but somehow jerky, wrong. She wasn't going to kill them. She showed no aggression. She was going to them to treat. "You need rest," she said in her new alien voice. She extended her hand toward Tyler, and he saw how her fingers began to change. They lengthened, stretched, becoming thin and pale like surgical instruments. Tyler recoiled in horror, stumbled, and fell. "Mia, wake up. It's me, Tyler." "Patient requires sedation." The thing that looked like Mia stated evenly, continuing to approach. And at this very moment, when her elongated fingers almost touched Tyler's face, something unimaginable happened. Throughout the hospital, on all floors, in all wings, red lights began to light up chaotically. Dozens, if not hundreds. The building filled with a deafening, mind-numbing cacophony of rattling bells. All the beds, all the patients had awakened simultaneously. Quarantine was breached. The system had gone mad. Jake grabbed Amber's hand. "To the exit, now." He rushed to Tyler, yanked him to his feet, and pushed him toward the door. "Run." They burst out of the main hall onto the staircase landing. The corridors that had been dark before now pulsed with hellish red light. Dozens of flashing bulbs created a strobe effect, turning reality into a nightmare. The deafening, ringing beat on their ears, not allowing them to concentrate. They rushed down the stairs, jumping over steps. Behind them came even, unhurried steps. Nurse Mia was following them. She didn't need to hurry. She was part of this place, and they were just lost patients in her hospital. "This way," Jake shouted, turning into a side corridor on the first floor. He remembered there was an exit to the courtyard here. They raced down the corridor lit by flashes of red lights. Past them flew wards, in each of which a call was burning. It seemed the entire building was screaming, writhing in agony. The door to the street was locked. Damn, Jake hit it with his shoulder with all his strength. The door cracked but held. Together, all three of them fell on the door. Once, twice. On the third blow, the old wood couldn't stand it, and the lock flew out with a piece of the frame. They tumbled outside into the pre-dawn gray mist. The cold morning air burned their lungs after the stale atmosphere of the hospital. They didn't stop. They ran across the overgrown courtyard to where they had left the truck. Behind them, the huge hospital building pulsed with red light, and from its broken windows poured the incessant, mind-numbing ringing. They reached the Chevy, jumped inside. Jake turned the key in the ignition with trembling hands. The engine coughed but started. He floored the gas pedal. The truck roared, lurched forward, spraying mud. Tyler turned around. In the doorway they had just run from stood a dark silhouette, Mia. She just stood and watched them leave. She wasn't chasing them. There was no need. They had burst onto the forest road and raced away, not choosing their path, away from that cursed place. The truck flew down the forest road. Branches whipped the windows. The engine howled desperately, but Jake didn't slow down. He drove, gripping the wheel with whitened knuckles, his gaze riveted to the road. In the cabin hung silence, broken only by his heavy breathing and Tyler's sobs. He sat in the back seat, covering his face with his hands. His camera lay on the floor. The content was over. Reality had begun, from which you can't hide behind a lens. Amber sat next to Jake, pale as a sheet, and stared straight ahead. They had driven several miles already. The forest around was gradually lightening, the first rays of dawn breaking through the bare branches. The hellish ringing was left behind, replaced by the silence of the forest. It seemed everything was over. They had broken free. They were saved. "We made it," Tyler whispered, raising his head. His face was wet with tears. "We left." Jake didn't answer. Amber slowly turned her head and looked at him. "Jake," he was silent. Tyler leaned forward between the seats. "Jake, you okay? Say something." He continued to look at the road. His face was absolutely calm, even serene, the same as they had seen on Mia. Tyler lowered his gaze. He wanted to pick up his camera, turn it off to save battery, and his gaze caught the dashboard. There was a weakly, barely noticeably blinking red light. It was the indicator of an open door, but all doors were closed. He had slammed his own, and Amber and Jake had locked theirs. They hadn't let anyone in. A cold that had nothing to do with the morning chill slowly crept up Tyler's spine. He looked at the blinking light again. It burned unevenly, pulsed like a sick heart. And it was exactly the same shade as those lights in the hospital. Tyler slowly, with horror that paralyzed his body, raised his eyes to Jake, to his profile, clearly outlined in the light of the approaching dawn. And Jake spoke. His voice was even, calm, absolutely alien. The same voice that Mia had spoken with. "Need to check all patients," he said without taking his eyes off the road. "Provide them with rest." Tyler looked at Amber. She was looking at him. In her eyes he saw the same understanding, the same indifferent horror. They hadn't escaped. They had just changed wards, and now their ward was on wheels, and their new nurse was sitting behind the wheel, taking them into the unknown to provide care. Tyler wanted to scream, but only a quiet, choked wheeze came from his throat. He looked out the window. Dead pines flew by. They were no different from those that surrounded the hospital. They were still in Pine Valley, and it seemed they would never get out of it. Honestly, I hoped that only Tyler would remain in that hospital, because his behavior raises a lot of questions. Unfortunately, the main characters didn't survive and remained in that very hospital. Don't go exploring abandoned places, and everything will be fine in your life. Give us a thumbs up or tree emoji, whatever's more convenient, so we know how many of us listened to the story to the very end. And as always, I'm not saying goodbye to you because we'll hear each other again where? That's right, in the next terrifyingly interesting story. Don't forget to hit the bell, write comments, and give big thumbs up. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.